First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit from a historical perspective, because I'm quite interested in the institutional conditions in our various fields that led to this situation where some quite interesting and rich work that was going on around uncertainty decades ago has somehow become bowdlerised and diluted, and where it's been built on in some rather odd kind of ways that seem to act as if uncertainty isn't really uncertainty. So I'm going to say a bit about that. I'm going to pick up on a theme in Frank Knight's work that is one of these things that seems to have disappeared from subsequent consideration of his work quite a lot, is his insistence that actually the problem of classification is a really important part of uncertainty. So I'm going to talk about the naming of things and frames and classification and how that might be important, how we think about uncertainty. And I'm being a bit cheeky when I come to the next bit, because I'm borrowing a phrase of Gerd Gigeren's as the human adaptive toolkit and using it for a lot more than he uses it for, where he focuses on this idea of simple rules and heuristics. And it's clear that as human beings, some of the time we do things by following rules and heuristics. But it seems to me that this tendency to examine our behaviour as if mostly what we do is follow rules is still picking up on the problem that we've created in psychology by using the computer as a metaphor for brains. And mostly we are not rule-following machines. We do other kinds of things. We think associatively, for example. So it seems to me that it's important to think beyond just this idea of our brains as rule-following machines, and go beyond also, where we're thinking about alternatives to some of the ideas in, for example, the judgment and decision-making literature, to go beyond this idea of simple heuristics, even where as Gigerenz would have it, they're heuristics that make us smart. And broadly, I'm going to consider two approaches: modelling the future and our impact on it. So I want to start off by going back to Simon's idea of bounded rationality. And Simon had quite a rich description of bounded rationality, but in particular he used this metaphor for bounded rationality as being constructed through two pairs of scissors. Two blades of a pair of scissors. And the first blade being the structure of task environments, and the second the computational capabilities of the actor. And actually subsequent work that has drawn on Simon's work has really focused almost exclusively on that second blade, the cognitive limitations of the decision maker. Yeah? Whereas, and actually has also wanted to talk about those cognitive limitations in terms of human irrationality. Whereas Simon really was insisting that this is about rational behaviour, thinking about how people actually make decisions in real contexts. He wasn't insisting that we were somehow irrational, but that this was perfectly rational way of behaving, given the way our cognitive limits interact with the information environments that we face. So here's the thing with Knight's work. He made a number of really important distinctions. The first thing, thank you, that's helpful. The first thing that he did, as many economists have built on his work, is he noted that under risk we should be able to state what the probabilities are, and under uncertainty we can't state what the probabilities are. But he also noticed two other things. The first is that in uncertainty, what we're really talking about is not knowing the outcome space. We can't specify all of the relevant outcomes. And that's a really important feature of uncertainty that's largely been ignored as economists have built in Knight's work. That's not how technology saves us from work. Oh, this is really old technology. I'm going to skip ahead in my slides when I'm talking about this problem of classification. I'm going to read you a bit of a poem because I think it's quite useful here. It's Nicholas Bealeby's The Naming of Things. Adam's commission, the naming of things, if only in the imagination, brings them into existence. Objects of thought, like God, breathes into them the power of the word. But towards the end of the poem, he says, but in the imagination still I know there's something nameless does not let me go. And what seems to me Bealeby is talking about in this poem is what in sociology we would describe as the social construction of reality. So let's think about something very simple. Remembering this problem of Knight's about classification. That brick, if I'm holding a brick in my hand like that and I let it go, it's going to fall, probably on my foot, but it's going to fall whether I believe in gravity or not. Yeah? But as social beings, as human beings, most of the facts of our existence are not like that fact. Many of the facts of our existence are affected by whether we believe in them or not. Giving you an example, money. Yeah? Money is a really important social fact in our society, but money really only works so long as enough of us believe in it. In the Weimar Republic and more recently in Zimbabwe and so on, we've seen the consequences of belief in money breaking down in those societies. And it's not pretty. And most of our interactions in the world, in business, are driven by social facts that only work so long as we have a shared belief in them. And that has a consequence in terms of the way in which beliefs changing can change. There's one of the problems that we've had in social sciences is a kind of physics envy. We want to discover invariant laws. But so many of the laws we discover only work until they stop working. And partly that is because they change when beliefs change. So, but another aspect of that is to do with the open-endedness of the social spaces that we open up. In many problems, for example, particle physics, we can define a phase space that we can put certain boundaries around, we can say things stochastically around it, we can close things off in some sense. But in the biological world, and hence in the social world, if we think about the way things can unfold, it's much more open. So let's go back to that brick. Yes, it has a kind of physicality, and if I let go of it, it's going to behave in certain reliable ways. But if we think of all the things that we can do with this thing socially, yeah, would anybody like to bet me that they can enumerate all of the possible uses of a brick? Yeah? And if it's really hard to enumerate all of the possible uses of a brick, how much harder is it to enumerate all of the possible uses of something like blockchain?
There are no uses of blockchain.
I might agree with you about Bitcoin. But very often, a lot of the uncertainties in our social world come from the open-ended nature of the affordances of the social objects that we create. That we never end innovating in the ways in which we can we can use them and create new things with them. And out of that comes one of the other things that I want to talk about in terms of how uncertainty is starting to be thought about in the business and management research field, which is a focus not only on the threats posed by uncertainty, but the opportunities posed by uncertainty. And this comes back to Knight's point about uncertainty as a source of profit for the entrepreneur, especially if they can exercise superior judgment of various kinds. So, this gets to the bit where I can talk about, what am I doing for time? I can talk about some of the ways in which people have started thinking about uncertainty somewhat more recently. So the first is that, as I've been inferring to there, one of the really important ways of engaging with thinking about uncertainty in the world of business and management is that realisation that we're living in a social world. And a lot of the nature of the uncertainties that we face relates to this nature of the fact that we are making the world as well as describing it. Very nice example of that, given by Don McKenzie in his work, a very nice book actually, which almost perfectly describes the situation, where he describes economics as an engine, not a camera, in financial markets. And by that he means that what economic theories are doing is not so much describing what goes on in markets as making what goes on in markets happen. A very nice example of that is the Black-Scholes theorem for pricing options. When it started to be adopted within financial markets, actually changed people's beliefs in such a way that it made the behaviour of options prices behave much more closely to the predictions of the theory. Until something came along called long-term capital management, big market collapse, and that actually changed people's beliefs about the way in which some of these things worked, and suddenly the Black-Scholes theorem wasn't quite so good at predicting prices anymore. Yeah? So the nature of people's beliefs, as driven by some of the academic theories sometimes that we have about the social world, can actually change the way in which the social world works. So if we're modelling our future and the impact on it, one of the ways in which, for example, Gigerenzer and his colleagues have suggested is that we use fast and few frugal heuristics to decide what to do, to think about what's likely to happen next. That was really brought home to me at the conference on rebuilding macroeconomics, when there were Henry Brighton, site there, was making a presentation to an audience rather, I guess more than 50% would been economists, mostly macroeconomists. And there was an interesting misunderstanding of his presentation at one point that I thought was very revealing. The misunderstanding was that, as he was trying to point out, that over-elaborated models are not very good once you start trying to use them out of sample. There's a non-godicity and so on, the future is not always like the past, and that simpler models will often work better. A lot of the economists thought that he was saying that as a criticism of their modelling, and were at pains to assure him that, yes, they really understood this point, and that because of that, they used rather parsimonious models and were very careful not to go for over-elaborated models. Which I thought was interesting, because in economics, one of the things that we tend to assume is that at the bottom of this sort of aggregate pyramid of consumer behaviour, what's going on is that people should be making decisions with all available information, treating it in the most sophisticated way that they're capable of, and if they're not doing that they're irrational. Yeah? So these kind of simple heuristics for determining your decisions are typically described as irrational in economics, in behavioural economics certainly. So using very, very simple models effectively a heuristic is rational if you're an economist or other kind of theorist, but it's irrational if you're an ordinary person making everyday decisions. Secondly, there's another branch of work that suggests that, and this is largely looking at strategic decision-making by managers, is that what people are typically doing when faced with large world problems with a great deal of uncertainty involved is that they're making small world representations of them. I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later in an example. And the issue here is not that it's the wrong thing to do. It's often remarkably useful. A small world representation of a much more complex problem can give us interesting kinds of insights into it. But it's a bit like, as Lenny was talking about earlier, the need to get out of model land. It's that the problem is when you get stuck in that small world representation as if it's the world. And that strategic decision makers who are doing this well are good at moving in and out of their small world representations while not mistaking them for the world. While the real danger that people are facing is that you get stuck in their small world representations. Now, by small world representation, I don't quite necessarily mean the same as the kind of quantitative models that Lenny was talking about earlier, though they may be an important subset. But they could be something as simple as a story about how we think consumer needs will evolve over the next few years. A third avenue of inquiry has been this notion of analogical reasoning. You know, the question of, we've not met this situation before, but we've met others that were like it in the following regards, and can we reason by another? This is what worked there. Maybe that we can figure out what the analogue of what worked over there would be in this situation. Another strand that's been going on for some time, but has more recently been linked much more firmly to this idea of uncertainty in the environment, is Thies's idea of dynamic capabilities. Dynamic capabilities are what distinguishes firms who are good at preparing for and responding to unpredictable changes in their environments. And what Thies had noticed is that a prior literature on resilience, various kinds of endowments that make organisations resilient to shocks. But the problem with a lot of the resilience work is that building resilience is an expensive thing to do. So actually, if your environment is quite stable, then those firms that invest in resilience will often fail simply because they can't produce at the same prices as firms who aren't investing in resilience. And the need for resilience doesn't arise enough that they succeed. So started saying, well, what are the particular capabilities that are useful in context of genuine uncertainty? I think identifying, there's quite a lot of empirical work now looking at these capabilities in different firms and trying to characterise them in more detail. But Thies broadly identifies three kinds of capabilities: sensing, seizing and transforming. Sensing when there are threats or opportunities that have not been understood particularly well before. Seizing those opportunities, and quite importantly, the capability to transform your organisation in order to respond to those new threats and opportunities. Going back to this point of all the different kinds of affordances that social objects can have, different uses for a brick, or there's a strand of research on entrepreneurship which is looking at what are the logics of opportunities that these firms face, and noting that a lot of the focus in economics has been on the logic of discovery, that You do some research to find out that there is a niche out there where there's an existing need that's not being well met. You set out to fill it, and it's a situation of information asymmetry. You've discovered some information that other entrepreneurs presumably don't have or haven't attributed the same meanings to, and that's where your profits come from. But much more in line with Knight's notion of where profits come from, this new strand of entrepreneurship research that's been building up over the last decade is interested in logics of opportunity creation. And I'm going to skip ahead to some of those in a moment. And I'm not going to say much about biological versus physics metaphors because I want to keep time down. But let's just skip forward to some examples. If I can make this work. This is a rather, for those of you not comfortable with the title of this slide, it's rather long words for saying something very simple, which is that if the future's not always the same as the past, simple rules work better than significantly elaborated rules. That's that point I was making about the economists earlier. But there's a very nice example that Gigerenzer and Brighton give that I like, and if you're familiar with finance, you'll be familiar with it. But Markowitz won the Nobel Prize for the elaboration of the optimal portfolio theory. And basically what he noticed is that if you combine assets in your portfolio that have different kinds of volatilities and are relatively uncorrelated in terms of the way their prices behave, then you can pull off a bit of a trick, which is that by combining them in the right kind of way, for the same level of risk, you can get a higher return, or for the same level of return, you can have a lower risk. And what this theory does, it basically says, given some characteristics that we know about the basket of assets you're trying to combine, we can we can create an optimal set of ways of combining them that will give you the optimal trade-off between risk and return. And it's quite a complex calculation, especially if you've got lots of things in that portfolio, but it's essentially mostly computable. Here's the interesting thing, is Markowitz never used his own theory in his own investment portfolio. He used a 1 over n heuristic. Take n classes of asset and invest 1 over n in each of them. Just share out your money equally between those assets. Don't worry about doing the calculation. So that's interesting. He won the Nobel Prize for it, but he didn't use the theory. But more recently, some people have been doing some research and actually said, well, let's compare this. Let's take the 1 over n strategy and let's take optimal portfolio theory. And although optimal portfolio theory has been proven mathematically to be right, given that we know all of the inputs into the model, that given is the big problem. Because we don't know all of the inputs into the model. So, for example, we need to know the volatility of the assets. What we know is we know their past volatility. We don't know their future volatility. Yeah? And that is why typically that 1 over n strategy performs better. That simple rule in most situations turns out to give you as good as or better return than the much more complex theory because of this problem of non-ergodicity. The future is not always like the past. Okay, so small world representation. So this is Leventhal's picture. It's always difficult seeing 3 dimensions in 2, isn't it? But 3 dimensions here. On the bottom 2 scales, you've got level of uncertainty and whether alternatives are well specified or ill specified. What Leventhal is suggesting that most actual strategic problems are out here. They tend to be in a space of uncertainty, and amongst highly ill-specified alternatives. But what we tend to do is we tend to construct a representation, a small world representation of the problem we're facing in this space here, where we're talking about risk, not uncertainty, and well-specified outcomes. So we're taking some subset of the problem. But he also notices that the problem is even more serious than that, because actually when we're thinking about strategic issues, we're also concerned with this axis where we want a fairly coarse-grained representation, not a fine-grained representation. So a lot of his work is, in the paper I'm citing is concerned with, how do people move between these different spaces in terms of thinking about the problems that they face? Or do they just get stuck in this space here as if it is the real problem? And again, I think it sort of comes back to Lenny's point about getting out of model land. I think it's a very, very similar kind of point. So to give an example of that, the battery's running out of this. Maitland and Sammartino in 2015 produced a case study of a multinational mining company who used small world representations to think about a very complex problem they're facing. They were interested in buying a mine in this African country with a serious history of conflict. They didn't have experience of operating in that context, and there were massive political uncertainties. There are other kinds of uncertainties around the project as well, around the likely performance of the mine and so on, but they identified these political uncertainties as really important. Now, clearly, this is a space of uncertainty. They had to ask themselves questions like, would the government honour its contracts with them? Would they be able to effectively work with the local communities? Would the local context become so violent that this asset that they'd invested a lot of money into became completely worthless to them, and so on? So they had to think quite hard about all of these things. So how did they go about it? Well, they first of all identified some key salient variables. Subset of all of the issues they needed to consider. And they initially characterised the context as politically unstable, violent and corrupt, and that suggested to them that the political dynamics were probably the most important source of uncertainty. So they asked themselves, how do we identify key relevant information? Well, they developed some stop and search rules for themselves. Completely improbable that they could collect all of the relevant information, so what might be some shortcuts? Well, one of the heuristics they used was to go and talk to other multinationals operating in this environment, interested in a couple of particular kinds of things. One is, was this a government that was likely to stick to its commitments once it made them? The second thing is, a very important question they wanted to ask of other multinationals and got answered for them was it possible to operate in this context without making illegal, unethical payments to secure cooperation? And the third question they wanted to ask was, could they work with local communities? All of this was overlaid by quite a lot of analogical thinking. Nobody had worked in this country in this industry before, but a lot of people on the board had relevant experience from a wide range of contexts. So they were also constantly thinking analogically along the lines of, it's a bit like when I was in this situation, or it's a bit like when I was in that situation, and having conversations about to what extent those analogies applied. And that final point about the experience and cognitive diversity in the team was really important as well, because one of the things that helped them not do is it helped them not get stuck in this small world representation, but try and set it in a wider context. So they could knowingly say, look, we're absolutely looking at a subset of the information as it relates to some, but not only, but not all of the key variables that we think are important in this case. What insights are coming out from that? But this isn't a model in the, in the sense that we throw in the information, turn the handle, and the answer comes out. It doesn't let us off the hard work of thinking very hard about this issue in its particular context. This point about logics of opportunity. Again, some examples. So, I don't know if you remember, I mean, most of us familiar with modern touchscreen computers, but does anybody remember the ill-favoured adventure that Microsoft had initially into touchscreen computers, which didn't, I think it lasted about a year? They asked themselves the question, is there a market for touchscreen computers? Thought, well, we don't know, we'll produce some, try and sell them, and very quickly found that they weren't selling very many and gave up. So on the basis of trying to discover if there was a market for touchscreen computers, pretty conclusively they discovered there wasn't one. And then, not too long after, along came Apple. They didn't discover whether there was a market for touchscreen computers, they created a market for touchscreen computers. And I think the path that they took to that is quite interesting. So it had been going on for some time, and some of this may not have been intentional at the time, but we think about the early iPod. Very quickly they developed a device that people got used to controlling with a gesture on a circular panel, and actually very quickly it became about the movement of your finger. That developed increasingly over successive iterations of the iPod. They introduced a phone. The early iPhone, one of the really interesting things about it is it really didn't include any engineering innovations in the sense of major new technologies. It only included incrementally improved technologies. They made some incremental performance improvements to some existing technologies. Probably the most important of which was that they kept on incrementally improving till they got to the point where on a touch screen you could move your finger across the screen with no discernible lag as something followed your finger. The lag interval was too small for the human eye to detect. And that proved to be a crucial point to pass by. But as the market was really focused on everything happened on the PC, and why wouldn't it? Because they kept on getting more powerful with every successive year, so it seemed like that was a pretty embedded way the world was going to work for some time to come. Java had all of these capabilities around servers and networks and the things that they thought they could be doing on the web and so on, and they just weren't in a position to exploit all of those. So they came up with a very interesting strategy, which was to produce this computing language and capabilities behind it called Java, which allows you to program things on a browser where a lot of the back-end stuff could be done on a server at a distance, but you're seeing it on your screen. And then they gave it away for free to all of the other companies who might want to use it. Why did they do that? Because presumably they could have made quite a lot of money by selling it as a capability. Well, what they realised is if they gave it away for free, the maximum number of possible users would use it. It would start perhaps to set a new standard. And their real goal wasn't making money directly out of Java. Their real goal was, how do we change this computing market from one that's PC-centric to one that's web-centric? And to do that, they needed to get people doing their computing on the web, not on the local PC. And they quite successfully shifted the whole market so that the social facts around them changed. And that really did have a big impact on the demand for the services that firms like that can do. Now, Java's increasingly been supplanted by other more up-to-date computing languages and systems that will do that stuff on the web for you. But in a sense, why would Sun Systems care about whether it's Java or it's the next generation that's come from somewhere else? Because that job has already been done of getting people to think naturally about how do we do stuff on the server, on the network, in a distributed way, as opposed to just with the computing power of the computer that's sitting on your desk. And of course, all of that's carried through into a world in which it's not just web-centric, but the assumption is that the way in which we're accessing those web services is not just on a PC, but it might be on your phone, your tablet, or your other device of choice. I just want to show two slides very quickly. I think the first is a set of research questions that I think some of all of this work imply that I think are really worth pursuing in my field, but I think they should have resonance in some other fields. So what are the characteristics of good analogies when we're using analogical thinking in relation to uncertainty? What conditions, organisational routines and endowments will support effective updating and flexible deployment of small world representations? What supports logics of opportunity creation under uncertainty? And the last point I've not really talked about. And this last one here, how do human capacities for narrative and emotion inform imagination and analogical thinking and opportunity creation in business contexts? But more important, I think, are a set of meta questions, which is that if I'm right, and one of the things that's gone on that's meant that we haven't really treated some of the things that Simon and Knight had to say about uncertainty seriously enough, one of the reasons is the way in which, as the field of business and management and the field of economics have matured, that there's become all of these disciplinary barriers that have sprung up, that has meant that kind of cross-disciplinary work, the work is much harder to do. Then we might have some other kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves. So how do we overcome the institutionalisation of boundaries between mature research fields and the suitable questions and methods that they focus on to create a new science of uncertainty between ourselves? Do business and management theory, and I suspect some other areas, need to move away from the seduction of mathematically tractable models to rediscover capabilities for rich description? I think anthropology does this really well. And can model-based approaches be improved by, and I'm pretty sure that Richard would agree with this, by a radical acceptance of models as fictional acts of imagination which can aid understanding and judgment but not supplant it? Now my hunch is that this last one is something that a lot of people would agree with but rarely practice. So some of this is about the practice, not just the theory. That's me. Thank you.